Hello and welcome to the Guest Education Global Leadership Summit. Thank you very much for joining us, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Daniel Sobel, founder and CEO of Inclusion Expert, and Dr. Abigail Gewirtz, child psychologist and author, who will be sharing their ideas and expertise on the impact of lockdown on the health and well-being of children across the world. But that's more than enough from me. I hope you enjoy the session, and over to you, Daniel and Dr. Abigail.
Well, it's a real pleasure to see you again, Abby. And I was interested to know whether your latest book was planned before lockdown hit or after, because it's incredible timing, all about how to speak with children about anxiety, how to help families with anxiety. I mean, it just seems like the perfect book at the perfect time. So was that completely coincidental, or how did that evolve?
Well, I wish I could say, so first of all, it's a treat to be back with you, Daniel. I wish I could say, as soon as the pandemic hit, I planned this book and I wrote it in 2 months and then it was released. But no, that's not the case. And I think the reality is more interesting, even if it is a little bit more disturbing, which is that over the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen increases in anxiety and depression among children and adolescents. And I decided to write the book back in 2016. I live in the United States, even though I don't sound American. And we had been seeing concerning increases in children's anxiety around all sorts of things. So the title of the book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, is really focusing on things that happen outside the home, whether they are global climate change or violence. In the United States, we have a really big problem of violence in schools, in the community, perceived problem, and issues, social justice issues around things like immigration or racism, things like that. And so that's why I decided to write the book. And then lo and behold, a pandemic came along.
Incredible. It's interesting because of all of the books to try and reach out for, yours is in a way the kind of the most obvious, and the one which I want to say to teachers and to parents, this is a must-have right now. I'm sure it's relevant anyway. Sorry, I was just trying to emphasize the specific moment of it. I mean, it's an incredible contribution, really. And I wonder, in general, how equipped you feel that I'm a parent of 3 children. I wonder, I don't feel very equipped to deal with my own children's anxiety in general, but how much more so sort of now. Are we, as parents, equipped, and teachers as well, are we equipped to deal with children and their anxieties?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. And the interesting thing is you're a parent of 3, and you're an expert in this area, in the sense that you work with social emotional issues with kids in schools all the time, on a large scale. And I think the question is a pointed one. We are not, listen, who's been taught to be a parent? You know, how do we parent? We parent based on what we learned when we were kids. Either we decide that we're going to go that route, or as the Americans would say, route, I should say route, or we decide on a different route. But that's really, the work of a parent is hands-on. I wish we all had to take courses to become parents. Even if we took a course to become a parent, would that teach us about how to help anxiety? I wish. I'm not so sure. I think, we know that we learn about anxiety in a number of ways, but as parents, a lot of the way that we deal with our children's anxiety is colored by our own anxiety. And so when you talk about what it's like to be parenting now in the middle of a pandemic and dealing with our children's anxiety now, what makes it so hard is that we parents are so stressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how something which I bang on about quite a bit in both the press and social media as well, is how we ask our teachers to teach children when we don't fully equip them to be able to teach, a child, for example, who presents with hyperactivity, or a child who presents with autistic spectrum or whatever. How have we fully equipped our teachers and trained them up to be able to include them in the classroom effectively? And I think the answer is generally no. And it feels to me like in the pandemic, where we are asking our teachers, who it's just incredible what teachers have been doing, and actually highly underrated in the press and in social media, just about how much they're doing. They have their own lives to manage and their own children and families to manage, and on top of that they're teaching. And people think that schools have been closed. Well, actually, teaching a workload is not closed. So I'm just wondering how much we're sort of burdening our teachers with the responsibilities of including children who are stressed and having to deal with parents who are stressed and anxious and so on.
Yes, I mean, all I can say is yes. Teachers, we're really overburdening our teachers, and I think we're going to see the impact of stress related to the pandemic over the next few years. It's not going to end when we're able to go back to the new normal. You pointed out that many teachers are themselves parents, that even if schools are closed, they're not, because teachers are teaching online. And I'm sure that and I know that in England, the schools have been open a lot. In America, they've barely been open. My daughter went back to school last week for the first time in 11 and a half months. When teachers teach online, they get a new and sometimes difficult glimpse into the life of their students. And just last week in the United States, there was a news report about a 9-year-old girl who broke down online because she was so hungry. And her mother had lost her job, and the family had no food, and who can learn when they're hungry? And so these are the burdens that we're burdening teachers with. But, it sounds hard to say that, it's not that the mother and the child are burdening the teacher, but the stress that is surrounding all of us, and some more than others, is really being felt by teachers.
Yeah. So in a way, regardless of whether you're in a sort of a private, an independent school with sort of, parents from a sort of a wealthy background, or you're in the state system in whichever country you're in, and you're dealing with parents from, let's say significantly poorer backgrounds, either way, you're on the front line. And we don't often think about teachers as frontline workers. But I think you think about ambulance drivers and medics and people, police, and so on and so forth. But really, they are on the front line because they're literally in people's homes on the screen, and they're there providing for children and so on and so forth. They literally are on the front line. I'm not sure really what the question is here, other than we think about needing to provide support for frontline workers, but we don't really provide support for teachers. And it feels to me like if ever there was a time to sort of bring out support for teachers, this is it.
That's such an important. I'm so glad you raised it. It wasn't really a question; it was a statement, but it was a correct statement. I mean, I do think of teachers as frontline workers, and just like policemen, and just like firefighters, and by the way, just like doctors as well. I mean, they're on the front lines, and we need to afford them the same supports that we afford medics and ambulance people and police officers. We're behind in doing that, and I really do think it needs to become an essential part of practice in supporting teachers.
Yes, I suppose perhaps it's worth stating overtly, because I do get a lot of very commonly get questions about how to boost children's curriculum attainment when they've missed school. And that's a very common question, which I find that school principals and senior leaders have been asking. Because actually, what I feel like saying is, well, before we home in on that, let's make sure that we deal with the anxiety and the stress, and to enable students to become, to feel safe and to feel human again. And I think that's sometimes missing, especially for teachers, senior leaders who get judged on the performance grade of children. What are your thoughts about that? Sort of emphasising the social, emotional, and mental health.
You know, it's funny because I've done quite a bit of work with teachers and social workers and social emotional work in schools. And, you know, it used to be that people thought children were ready for kindergarten when they could identify their ABCs or their letters and their numbers. And that's not what's most important. I know I'm saying this to you, but I'm saying this for the benefit of everyone else. What's really important for school readiness is the ability to sit down, to be able to hear the teacher, to really have the social and emotional regulation to be ready to learn. That's what's most important for success in school. And I think teachers know that, but an emphasis on social emotional learning is going to reap many rewards in terms of boosting learning in academic subjects. And I think often in schools, people feel like it's one or the other. We don't have time for social emotional learning because we're too busy teaching our kids the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s. Not at all, because what you'll get back will enable your kids to learn better.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought about how we help children transition back into a school setting where they may have been out for a while. I mean, obviously, there's lots of different. There's teachers from lots of different countries here watching this, and so let's just think about transitioning back into, let's say, normal schools experience where children aren't divided with masks and space between them and so on and so forth. There's lots of different types of transitions going on, I suppose, but. I wonder how long a transition to normal could be in school, or do we just say, right, the healthiest thing you students is to get back to what you remember, back into school, and that will provide with you for you the safety, the expectations, that rhythm, or do we say, no, scrap that, we're not going back into normal lessons, we're going to do a full transition process? What's your thoughts and feelings about it?
The latter. So I think wherever you are in the world, going back to, there's no going back to the way it was. I think we're going back to a new normal. We're talking about that more and more. And we know that there are a lot of kids everywhere in the world who are going to be very anxious about going back to school. Apart from anything else, if you haven't been used to your routine, so we are all creatures of habit, and our children even more so, and the structure and the support of everyday life is really important, and that's why kids do well in schools when they're provided with a clear structure and a predictability and a routine. However, when you're transitioning from one kind of routine to another, that's a disruption. It seems funny to say that going back to school is a disruption, but it is a disruption because that's not what has been in the most recent past. And so often I'll be on the phone on video conference calls with parents, and they'll say, well, my child's already told me they're quite anxious to go back to school. And what I'll say is, okay, so take a practice trip to school. If there's any chance to see your new teacher on video call, meet them on video call. If there's any way to know what books are you going to be reading, what's the curriculum going to look like, what's the day going to look like, practice, do a few dry runs, go up to the school building. If you're allowed in, go into the school building, help your young child by identifying the classroom. The more that you can do that, the easier the transition is going to be. And it doesn't need to start 4 months before, but make sure at least in the week or two, if possible, before school starts, and talk to the children. So if you're a teacher, have a chance to talk to the kids, if possible, before you go back. Try and build a community so that kids know each other. They know what you sound like. They know what's going to happen when they walk into the school. And that will really lower the anxiety. And most teachers, I think, already know that their own anxiety is easily transmittable to the kids, and it's exactly what happens at home as well. That if we're more panicky and worry a lot and transfer that to the kids, if we say, well, I don't know, then children get a sense of that worry too. But if we say, this is what's going to happen, and it's my job to keep everyone safe and learning in school, then children will get that sense of confidence.
So it's interesting. I've heard from quite a lot of school principals and senior leaders that said that when they came out of lockdown, at least the first time here in England, they noticed that the children seemed to be absolutely fine. And I found it quite difficult to articulate to them. What I really wanted to say is, you mean that's how they presented to you? But actually, you know, there's stuff going on for children that you simply may not see. What's your view on that? Am I being a bit too judgmental? I mean, what assumptions can we make, I suppose? What's a reasonable assumption to make about children who actually seem to be fine when they come to school?
Right. I mean, I think, you know, it was interesting. I was smiling because I was thinking about a headline in the papers, the kids are not fine. What we know in general about anxiety is that it's hard to identify the anxious kids in school because they're the quiet ones. They don't act up. They don't necessarily tell you often what's going on. And the older they get, the more that is the case. So I think let's not assume that the kids are all fine because they don't say, oh, I'm kind of freaking out and I'm really scared I'm going to fail next year because I don't remember what we were learning, etc. And I think that's going to be another challenge for teachers to figure out concretely where everybody is. What do kids retain? What have kids retained from the time they've been learning online or not being in school? But I think the assumption that because kids aren't shouting and screaming and saying, I'm really anxious, or because they show up, that means they're not anxious. And I also don't want to be the scaremonger who says 90% of your kids are going to be anxious. I don't think that's the case. I mean, the wonderful thing is that we're all different. We're all alike, but we're all different. And there are kids who are much more go with the flow. And those are the kids who are going to be the good buddies to the kids who are less go with the flow and having a harder time.
Apart from buying your book, which I think is a must read right now, and possibly buying some of my online training for social emotional mental health pedagogy, what could leaders in schools be doing right now? What 2 or 3 absolute givens, practical things should they or could they be doing to be aware, to mitigate, to plan? What do you recommend?
I would say if you have a social emotional expert in your school, whether that's a social worker or a psychologist, or even if there's one in the district, borrow that person and bring them in for planning of, the opening of school. So have them involved so that they can help you think about what are the routines and the rituals that will help kids feel comfortable in schools. I think that is particularly important when you are also bringing kids into school with restrictions. How do we help our 5-year-olds understand that they must keep their masks on, that they cannot hug their friends in the playground? And I really hope that for the next school year that won't be the case. But the more there are restrictions, the more it would be helpful to have somebody who can help you think about how kids think and what they worry about. And yes, by all means, they should go out and get your training, Daniel, and read my book, which was written for parents, but also for teachers, about how to have conversations with kids about frightening topics.
I'm rather hoping, actually, that one of the positive outcomes of all of this will be that what becomes an essential part of teacher training is understanding what's going on emotionally and psychologically for children. It's not actually a prerequisite for teachers to be either emotionally intelligent or have an awareness of child development necessarily. And I hope that, that these unusual circumstances that we're in, it kind of calls us to action. We really need to. And so perhaps it'll be something that will be this sort of like epoch change, the shift in the way that we think about, the level of knowledge and understanding of children, of adults understanding children, let alone managing our own personal mental health and so forth. That's me being perhaps overly positive. I don't know, but there's an opportunity there, I think.
I really hope so, Daniel. And people, people don't think about this, but pediatricians, child doctors, they don't get training in child development. And police officers, I feel quite proud to say that I was part of the first partnership that taught police officers about child development. And so anyone who interacts with kids on the front lines should be provided education in at least typical development. What can we expect in social emotional development? But the other big role is for people, that you work with and that I work with, who are around and near schools and can provide some support to teachers to help them not only talk to kids and listen to children and pick up the signals about when kids are distressed, but also to help support teachers so that they don't burn out and they're not dealing with what we call secondary traumatic stress. When you look into the home of a child and you see a starving child or a child who is dealing with an incredible amount of, whether it's abuse or sort of other kinds of tragedy, you also are affected by that. And you need to get support from someone. You need to know that someone has your back.
Yes, we're just trialing a program at the moment in 2 different regions in England of peer-led supervision, so teachers supporting teachers and helping each other come to terms with and manage their own personal psychological encounters. Every school in the world, hopefully, that we, at least in the Western world, has child protection support. But when you encounter child protection issues, it can be really extremely painful. And very often we don't manage the stress of teachers who encounter this all the time. Whereas it's inherent to the role of social workers and counsellors, psychologists and so on, that they go and get support with that, but not for teachers.
Unfortunately. But so let's hope for a new epoch.
Yeah. Talking of which, and big words like epoch and pandemic, I have this thought that, I don't know what you think about this, but it feels to me like there is a hidden pandemic here. There's this pandemic which everyone's talking about, which is this COVID-19 thing. I'm sure you've heard of it. But there's another pandemic which I think is going on, is what's happening to our children. And as you said earlier, we're not really going to know the impact of it for a while, but it feels to me like, just in case anyone's in any doubt who's watching this, it feels to me like anxiety is at a pandemic level. Pandemic level is very, very high levels of percentage of the population. Then I think that's, from my vantage point of seeing across quite a few thousand schools, it feels to me like that's what's happening. What's your sense, your experience of what's going on?
Well, I learned a new word, Daniel, syndemic. And a syndemic is a constellation of pandemics, right? So it's more than one pandemic. And I think you're absolutely right. So yes, I think there is a pandemic of distress, not just among our children, by the way, but also among their parents, and among anyone who is really pushed to the limit in this COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, we're also talking about a social, a pandemic of racism and social injustice. So that's the other. There, like I said, syndemic is the word for multiple pandemics. But yes, the kids are not all right.
I don't know if this is a reasonable question. I like the idea of, can we essentialize 1 or 2 or 3 things that every teacher should know right now? Is that a reasonable question for you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think about it as tools, okay? Tools that every teacher should have in their toolbox or tool belt or whatever it is. One is be aware of what's happening to you. and of your own stress, because when your own stress spills over, that's going to make it really hard for you in the classroom. So if you have something special that you can do right before you walk into the classroom, whether it's a virtual or a real one, whether it's just taking 10 deep breaths or stepping outside and breathing the air, do that. That's one thing. I think the second thing is that when kids are anxious, they display a variety of behaviors. So some kids, I said earlier, kids are quiet, but not all kids are like that. And my favorite example is the fear biter. And anyone who has a pet knows, particularly with dogs, that when they get anxious, they bite. And sometimes kids are like that too. I don't mean literally they bite, but some kids, they get angry and they act out as a result of their anxiety. And so let's think about anxiety as a reaction that can span a number of different behaviors. So I think that's the second thing. And the third thing I would say is, if possible, and there are so many things that teachers have to do, but if you can't do this, then make sure there's an administrator who can check in with every child every day. Say, how are you? Say their name and listen for their answer, to, if that's possible, to help your school feel like an inclusive and caring community, and even more than it is already.
It's quite hard being a human sometimes when we are playing the role of a teacher, isn't it? I think that we're expected to be really super professional and completely together, and we have the answers, and we need to be able to deal with parents' demands on us, and we need to be able to deal with children. And actually, more than ever, I think that we're stretched to be just humans. It's really, really difficult to be. I loved the line that one of my children's teachers said. She said, I should have got this ready. I should have done this. I should have done that. And I just couldn't do it. I've got my children in the background. So children, she's speaking to a bunch of 7-year-olds. She said, children, I've made mistakes and I want you to forgive me. And please understand, I'm just trying my best. And I just feel like, actually, that was really powerful. It was, a human moment. Yeah.
And not just a human moment, but in a way, it's a superhero moment, because what that teacher is teaching her children is to have compassion. And that is sometimes feels like it's in short supply. And I think that is such an important, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because that should have been my fourth tool, is to be compassionate towards yourself, and to be able to forgive yourself. And in the process, showing compassion, showing children how important compassion is as a value.
Abi, if I had the money, I'd buy your book for every school that I know, but I don't. But I encourage everyone who's listening to actually go forth and buy it. Thank you so much for this fireside chat. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you.
Well, the pleasure was all mine, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your time. I really enjoyed listening in on that discussion. It was full of really interesting and important subjects for our audience, and I'm sure they found it really valuable. So thank you everyone for listening. We very much hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you, and bye for now.